Iowa. Martha shot up from her deep sleep, as usual, to find a shadowy figure at the corner of her bed staring back at her. Martha had grown accustomed to the presence of that figure in her room. She would then open the lights and the figure would completely disappear. She would then shun the thought, considering it to be a nightmare, and go off to sleep again, but not before glancing at the clock, which would always read 3 a.m. in the morning. She would be curious and question the coincidence of always receiving the nightmare at 3 a.m., the answer to which never really occurred. She tried speaking to her parents regarding the same. Mrs. Rebecca Swift would console her daughter and try to put her to ease. "Honey, maybe you're just too knackered of all the work which is causing you to hallucinate. You need to relax, baby." Mr. Joseph Swift also wouldn't back in, assuring his daughter, "Don't worry, honey. You are just stressed out. All of this is just a fragment of your imagination and won't last long. I would suggest you take a break from work if possible." Martha would then feel better and purge further thoughts regarding the experience. This went on for 2 months, but the figure remained punctual enough to visit Martha every night. Martha was quite sure by now that this was neither work pressure nor sleep paralysis, as she could move comfortably. However, every time her parents carelessly ignored her perception. "It's useless talking to Mom and Dad. I guess I need to speak to Vicky Aunt." Vicky Aunt, or Mrs. Victoria Fernwald, was actually Mrs. Swift's real sister. She was a paranormal expert, and more so, she made sure to lend complete attention to her favorite niece. She would visit Mrs. Swift often, and make sure to always hand a neatly wrapped present to Martha. She would enter with a sweet smile plastered on her face. She wore her usual outfit comprising of a long gown, a leather hat, white gloves, and a pearl necklace. Her smile would gradually transform into a huge grin on seeing her favorite niece. She would rush over to Martha and embrace her tightly, and then secretly hand her the gift. After Martha deeply loved her aunt and felt quite comfortable to confide in her, she was damn sure that her problem would definitely have a solution if Vicky Aunt was to resolve it. She decided to visit Vicky Aunt the next day. "Mom, Dad, I am planning on visiting the library today. I need to read more and more content for my approaching projects. I'll be going there at 12 noon. Hope I am permitted," lied Martha. "Yes, dear. You may go, but make sure that you return before the sun sets," replied Mrs. Swift. Martha provided an approving nod. Martha kept her beady eyes fixated on the clock, as she couldn't wait to visit her aunt. She desperately needed a solution to her intense problem. "Bye, Mom, Dad. See you soon," said Martha as she left the house. Martha's aunt resided just 2 blocks away from her home. Mrs. Fernwald had a huge white mansion. Martha would always give the house an appraising glance. She loved the interiors of the house, which were way better than hers. The house had an amazing garden with ample tulip, hibiscus, and rose plants. Mrs. Fernwald would give strict instructions to the gardener and warn him of the consequences in case any plant was damaged. However, whenever Martha admired the plants, Mrs. Fernwald would eagerly hand a bouquet with a combination of all the plants to her niece, who would feel extremely overjoyed. Martha would then give a tight hug to her aunt while thanking her. Martha walked through the beautiful garden and reached the main door to the house. She rang the bell. Mrs. Fernwald herself opened the door. "Blimey. So glad to see you here, Martha. Please come in, darling. Lucy, please get some snacks for my darling niece." Mrs. Fernwald was buoyant and greeted Martha. She asked her to have a seat. "I am glad you visited me, honey. Is this visit backed by a purpose?" inquired Mrs. Fernwald. "Yes, Aunt. I know it may seem disappointing to you. Why would it disappoint me, sweetheart? Just go on. Tell me your story," Vicky, Aunt. I am here because of a mysterious experience. It's hard to say whether it's a nightmare or reality. I am tensed and don't know how to get out of this. Mom, Dad keep ignoring me. Then, I thought of you. Please help me, wept Martha. Mrs. Fernwald outstretched her arms and embraced Martha dearly. She intelligently deduced it to be a paranormal experience. Don't worry, honey. Everything will be fine. Just narrate the events that transpired with you and the duration of their occurrence. Martha wiggled her nose and narrated the entire story. Exclaimed Mrs. Fernwald, lost in her thoughts. Well, honey, I need you to answer some questions of mine. Okay, Aunt? Please go ahead. Firstly, since when have you been experiencing this? Since the past 2 months. That is ever since we entered the new house. Okay, and did you try changing your room any time? Never, Aunt. We do not have an extra room out there. Did anybody from your family happen to meet their demise 2 months back? No, Aunt. Not that I remember. Does the figure stir or just stay still? It remains as still as a statue, as if staring at me with pleasure. Who lived in that house initially? I guess an old couple lived there. The woman died of some disease and the man sold the house. Where did the woman die? No idea, Aunt. Well then, I need to talk to your parents for a further explanation of the story. Saying so, Mrs. Fernwald grabbed Martha's hand softly and brought her home.